storytelling 哈，他要那个妇女去想一下2045年的一个社会，它会是什么样一种社会，是他想要存在，然后那种社会彰显什么样一种价值。那透过这样的一种imagine 那也顺便能够去省思自己内心的一些价值的一些东西所以这个是做一个例子就是这种说故事的方式来推动人权教育你可能就是透过那个故事的内容里面去承认有一些人权的伤害去表彰这故事里面有哪些可贵的精神跟价值，然后我们要能够去记得这样的一个故事的一个惨痛的教训，然后能够去抵抗这个故事里面希望我们要去避免的一些事情然后最后就是用所谓的想象怎么样能够让他能够去想象未来世界一个人权有保障的世界应该是一个怎么样一个世界。换句话说，让人权的价值能够更根深蒂固的去让学生去接受跟理解。
So another author that does this a lot is Betty Ridden. So I keep speaking about her. Betty has a story that she wrote. It's fiction. It's an entirely fictional story about world order. She wrote it in 1990, I think, about the year 2000, something around that. And it was the type of world that she would have liked to have seen around 2000. Complete fiction, but again, it's another way that storytelling is being used to create the types of worlds that we'd like to see. Now, Betty draws off of another woman named Elise Boulding. And Elise Boulding was involved in global education. And she has a concept called 200-year present. So I find that this is also a very useful concept in order to teach about social change and to raise hope among students for what the possibilities are. Now, what the 200-year present is, as a quick way of introducing this, is we take today as our point of departure, and we ask our students to go back 100 years ago, and to imagine that today you're going to meet somebody who was born 100 years ago. So in that 100-year span of time, what are all the things that have changed? So again, we look at the human rights violations that have changed, etc. The passage of rights for different groups. So meeting that person, you're meeting history, you're meeting 100 years of the past. But also today, it's possible that you can meet a child that is born today that's going to live for 100 years from now. And imagine all of the changes that are going to take place socially and politically in terms of that child's life. And so what Elise Boulding said is we don't live today, we don't live just the past 5 years, we live in a 200-year present. And if we conceptualize the world in this way, then we realize the tremendous social change that is possible. Because 100 years ago, human rights did not exist, not in the way that they exist today. And mostly the world was run by dictatorships and authoritarian governments, like we saw in the video. But 100 years later, mostly the world's been decolonized, and there are rising free states. And so we can only imagine what will happen from 100 years from now. And we move our students through the process of imagining 30 years from now, or 100 years from now. And if that's our goal, what are all of the changes that need to take place in order to reach toward that goal? So Elise Boulding has this exercise, or this lesson plan in her book called Global Civic Culture. I think it's the name of the book, 1988. But this 200-year present is another way that we use storytelling with our students.
OK， 他有提到有一个作者 Elise Boulding。之前他另外提到一个叫 Betty Ridden， 其实他那个书台湾都有翻译的Betty Ridden 有本叫《人权教育》的就是 Betty Ridden 写的。然后他也有提到一个故事用他的，可是那个故事是完全是虚构的，是他自己写1990年，然后他虚构10年后2000年。不过那 idea 是一样，就是让学生去想。然后后来他就提到这个Elise Boulding。他有在1988的，他有另外一个叫他有一个方法，就是200年的呈现200 years presence。他的方法很简单，就是以我们现在，然后试想前100年的那个时候的状 后再去试想这后100年的时候的状况是这样。这样的做法是要去强调，就是说改变是有可能的。在100年前，你看我们都还是在那种专制的那种情况下面那可能在100年后会可能很多的一个不一样有可能去形成的。然后也可以去想说，如果要达成到这样的话，我们还有哪些努力需要去做？所以这是一种方法就是说延伸刚才讲的 storytelling 它可以是一个真实的故事，也可以是虚构故事。那用这个200 year presence 这200年的呈现这样一个方式去让学生去了解这种像这种人权并不是不可及的一种目标是有可能去改变而且已经有改变很大了。这种方法还不错了
Quickly, this is just some of the content areas that we have. What I've discovered is in Somalia when I'm working there with postgraduate students, usually what the community members and the postgraduate students are concerned about is gender bias. So the issue of human rights that they mostly discuss is gender bias, and then they use the NDGs and CEDAW and the different documents that I talked about earlier to discuss this. It's a really complicated issue, as you can expect, because of the cultural issues taking place within Somalia around patriarchy and around religion, but it is a way that we discuss the intersections between local human rights and global human rights. In Costa Rica, fair wages.
他接下去要讲人权教育的内容那他特别点出，就是他曾经在索马利亚有跟一群这种研究生那他们在进行人权教育那他讲的比较多的主题就是有关性别的偏见因为那是一个很复杂，因为最主要是那个环境那个文化下面，文化脉络下面比较是父权的一个体制所以说去提这一个他们很关心的就是这个性别的这种偏见这样的一个议题。
In Costa Rica, we mostly discuss fair wages. This is the issue that often comes up with students, and it has to do with the rise of the economy there, as it's becoming a more developed state, so to speak, and people are asking for higher wages. Fair wages in terms of globalization, as globalization comes into the state, how are farmers protected and how are other at-risk groups protected, that they receive fair wages and that their prices aren't pushed down by corporations. And also, how are wages ensured for immigrants who are coming across from Nicaragua and they're working in Costa Rica, but because they are immigrants, they often are given very poor jobs or they're working illegally, so they have very awful wages. So these are the issues that are usually discussed there around the right to employment, the right to a fair wage, and the issue that overlaps with that in terms of immigration.
在哥斯达黎加那在那边他们比较会去关心的但最主要是因为那个整个社会的经济发展所以他们会去谈这个 fair wage 就是公平的薪水的问题，然后也有去碰触到有一些是尼加拉瓜的移民进来的移工那他们的薪水的一个问题所以说这个部分他们就会去带到有关这种工作权还有这种工资一个公平工资这样一个权利这些概念在哥斯达黎加的讨论。
Okay, I'm just going to speed through this because it's taking longer than I wanted to take. In Korea, we often talk about the right to education. I can talk to you later about that if you're curious, but I'm just going to speed through it. Different pedagogies that we use are forms. So the storytelling we've talked about, cooperative learning, we're going to do a little bit later. Charter building in terms of the ways that we put the UDHR into the classroom and the ways that we have students interact and create their own classroom charters to mimic what the normative standards of human rights are supposed to be. Participatory pedagogy, popcorn reading, theater, role plays, these are different ways that the students become engaged. Now, theater and role play is one of the ways that we discuss this and its relevancy is in the way that I just talked about Martin Luther King earlier, is that often human rights and social justice it's a form of theater. And so our protest and demonstration are forms of theater to try to raise these issues. And so I think students understand then why they're using this type of methodology. And the mapping that we'll do a little bit later.
Sorry, that's a popcorn reading.
Oh, it's popcorn reading is a really simple way to have students participate in reading. So you read in the class, you read the text in class so that you know that everybody's reading it. But I will begin by reading a paragraph. And when I get to the end of my paragraph, I will say popcorn, and I would choose a student's name. And then that student will read the next paragraph. And when she finishes, she will say popcorn, and then she calls on another student. So it's just a way to bounce the reading around the class. The idea here is it's not human rights specific, but it's a participatory method.
OK 啊，这边在讲教学策略啊，刚才有提过那种故事的说法啊，有合作学习的啊，那个 charter building 就是类似定班级公约，啊，然后透过班级公约再回去看这个国际世界人权宣言的啊，那这个 popcorn reading 就是它比较不是跟人权明确，它比较是让学生有参与的啊，简单讲是大家接龙嘛，类似念一段完再换讲 popcorn 要换另外一个去读这个文献的啊，然后当然强调这种参与式的这种教学策略啊，然后 theater break 啊，他刚才特别提到哈，其实像马丁路德今天他们在倡议的时候，就是把它当成像是一个剧院剧场，要引起大家更广泛的注意，所以你也可以用这种角色扮演的方式，让学生去扮演啊，类似啊那个马丁路德金人那个时候，他为什么要去讲那段话啊？这个对他会有很深的影响啊。然后 mapping 等一下大概会做。OK。
Structures, so the ways that we try to mimic holism in human rights education by reflecting the values in our classroom, so emphasizing democracy, compassion, solidarity, peace. This happens in the charters, and when we create the charter with the students, it happens by posting the UDHR around the classroom, but trying to show that values are very important in our education. Student participation. So having students participating within the decisions of what they learn and deciding how they learn, as well as the grading. So how are they assessed around this as well. And then in terms of conflict, involving them in peer-to-peer mediation of the issues. So this is trying to reflect the human rights in the lesson planning in the classroom and the content teaching, and the way that that classroom is structured with students, and then the way that the student engagement with the school beyond the classroom is reflective of democracy and compassion and solidarity.
OK 啊，那他这边强调这个整个架构哈，那第一个强调这个价值哈，应该能够反映在你整个课程的架构里面啊，那包括几个重点啊，像这个民主啊，然后 compassion 啊。同情心和同理心、关理心、关怀，然后 solidarity 是团结啊，然后 peace 是和平啊，这几个价值都要能够反映在你整个课程的这个结构里面啊。另外他蛮强调啊，就是整个课程里面学生的参与要扮演非常重要的一个角色啊，因为我们重视权利主体，要重视学习主体啊，所以这个部分呢哈。他有举几个面向啊，包括内容啊，跟学生一起讨论决定，好，那整个课程的这个计划也跟学生讨论决定，好，然后甚至打分数，哦，也可以让同学同才互打，好，然后甚至也让学生参与啊这种冲突的这种调解 mediation 啊，这些都是让学生参与的一些面向哦，大家可以去注意一下。所以他很重视哈这个学生参与这样的一个面向。OK。
Indicators. These are mostly what we saw earlier. So I'll skip over it. Recommended resources. Resources I've been discussing. I need to check that one again on top. But Betty Reardon has written several human rights education documents in the 1990s. and continues to do so today around human rights and gender, especially in India. Alicia Kavizuto and Betty Reardon wrote Learning to Abolish War. They frame it as peace education, but human rights, there are many different human rights education lessons in that document. It's mostly lesson plans. So they give you a small book of philosophy, but then they give you 2 books of lesson plans that can be directly implemented into primary, middle, and high school. And then Audrey Osler and Hugh Starkey, the book that I've been referencing today, Teachers in Human Rights Education. So those are 3 of the more common texts that we end up using. But I need to check the first one because there's another book called Human Rights Education with a different author.
OK， 这3本书啊是他推荐的啊，2本比较是类似这种课程规划啊，那有一本最下面那本比较是哲学的，那这个是刚才有介绍过那个英国的这个人教育的学者Audrey Osler跟 Hugh Starkey Teachers and Human Rights Education， 这个是比较教育哲学的，然后前面这2本，第1本好像台湾有翻译，我没记错 ，Betty Reardon 人权教育那下面这个 Alicia 这个 Cabezo 他这个在网络上可以自己上网去找。OK。
And they're interesting approaches. If we break them down, because Audrey Osler and Hugh Starkey are British, and so they're mostly talking about human rights education in Britain and in the school systems in Britain, and then also perhaps a little bit outside the school system. Betty Reardon's from the U.S., so she's mostly talking about human rights education in formal and non-formal contexts in the United States, even though she works globally. And then Alicia Kavizuto is from Argentina. So she's a human rights educator that later became involved in what she calls cultures of peace education. And so her work is really coming out of Latin America, and so it has a different approach. It's much more non-formal, and it's much more around democracy and democratic engagement. So I find they're speaking about the same thing, but they have very interesting histories that give them a slightly different approach to the field.
这3者的背景都不一样所以下面那个 Audrey Osler 跟 Hugh Starkey 是英国人所以他们介绍比较是英国的一些正式或非正式课程有关人权教育然后第一个 Betty Reardon 是美国人虽然他也是全球在跑他介绍大概也是美国的这些，然后中间那个比较是阿根廷他介绍是比较非正式，就不是学校的这种人权教育比较强调民主的这种教育这一块然后就是比较是拉丁美洲的一些例子，所以如果大家可以去看到一些不一样的，虽然说他们讲的都是同样的人权教育，那个模式或许有一些因为这个脉络不一样，它的发展会不一样。
So as educators, again another reflection. If you find yourself interested in Michel Foucault or Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, Audrey Osler and Hugh Starkey are much more into Foucault and Bourdieu because they're European, right? So they have a different approach to this. Betty Reardon is more John Dewey because she's from Colombia and John Dewey's from Colombia and she's North American. So if you have more of a John Dewey civic engagement approach, then Betty Reardon seems to be perhaps the direction you might go. And Alicia Kavizuto is more about the Latin American educator Paulo Freire. So if you're really gung-ho about Freire and democracy and resistance, then I would say Kavizuto is the way to read it. So yeah, I think the kind of traditions of educators that they stand on really direct their approach.
OK， 他们的背景特别是学术上背景不一样，所以你如果对学术上有些背景有兴趣的话，像英国的这个 Audrey Osler 跟 Hugh Starkey 他那个法国哲学家那个傅科或是法国的那个，因为他们都是欧洲人所以他们对这些理论是比较涉猎的，所以他们反映的是比较跟你如果对这些哲学家有兴趣，然后那个 Betty Reardon 因为他本身就是在哥伦比亚大学，那杜威就是在哥伦比亚大学的教育学院很有名的那个，然后所以他的东西比较反映的就是杜威的那种经验教育这样的一种，所以如果有兴趣可以去看一下。
I should say Habermas for Osler and Starkey as well. Anyway, so that's the end of the kind of overview of this. So we're going to take a break for how long? 10, 15 minutes?
15 minutes.
How long do you need? 15 minutes? Let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 45. We're at 40, come back at 2:40, and then we'll go into the activities.
40分之后我们休息一下。接下去就要做活动。他刚才有提到有几种活动，大家可以来参与一下。
You use that book here, Human Rights Education, but it has different authors. So now you can choose. I have to go back and make sure it's right.
刚刚这个要关吗？休息10分。